Hello and welcome to Mirror of Intimacy, Daily Meditations for Emotional and Erotic Intelligence. I'm Dr. Alexandra Katahakis here at the Center for Healthy Sex in Los Angeles, and I welcome you to our conversation today, the topic being example. As always, if you have any questions while I'm talking, if you need resources or want to me to elaborate on a point, you can type into the chat box and we can either respond to you anonymously if you want an anonymous question answered. If you want to speak to an intake counselor, you can call 310-843-9902, which you see just popped up in the text box. You'll see Melissa's name and email address, so you can write to her and I can answer your question for you without you revealing who you are. Remember that if you do type into the chat box, your name will show up. So as long as you're okay with being identified, then you can just use that mechanism. So today is November 4th, and of course we are in the month of Thanksgiving, of gratitude, and I think this topic of example is apropos for that. I think it ties into a matter of integrity. And Albert Schweitzer is our quote for today, and he says, example is not the main thing in influencing others, it's the only thing. So it's not the main thing, it's the only thing. And increasingly, I think we live in a world that is moving so quickly and so personally organized that sometimes we can forget just how our actions influence and impact other people. And this may be more true if you live in a major metropolitan area where there's population density, where we're always jockeying for positions, to turn, to get on the highway, to get a parking spot, to get past a red light. So it's quite possibly happening where if you live in a place where there are more people and you're struggling for a position. And that's when I think we can be, well, let's say, just not be at our best. And so with this, it's important to remember, based on what Schweitzer's saying and what we also write in Mirror of Intimacy, that people respond predominantly to the example that we set. And so it doesn't matter how good our intentions are or how impeccable our word is. Ultimately, people respond to what we actually do. And that, I think, is the greatest challenge for us in terms of being good citizens, in terms of being good parents, good neighbors, and being just decent human beings, is what I do is actually influencing the people around me. And without a true mirror, someone mirroring back to us what we're doing, we can't see that actual example correctly. And I think that's a really good way to jump into the notion of early relationships. When our early relationships with our parents, for example, are marked by codependence or neglect or abuse, then we get a mirroring that actually warps our perceptions of ourselves and our actions. And I think about codependence, and I've written about this and talked about this, as a response. It's a trauma reaction. If somebody has to track the adults in their environment all the time to make sure that they're okay, to make sure that they don't do or say anything that's going to get them in trouble or attacked emotionally or physically or verbally, then a child is going to bend itself to shape itself around the people that it's growing up with. And therefore, they're going to get distorted. They get distorted mirroring, and so they give distorted mirroring back. And hence we get these codependent constructs where we are more inclined towards taking care of other people to make sure they're okay than to really checking in with ourselves and asking ourselves what we want and what we need. And attachment theory identifies different relational styles, one of which is functional, and we call that secure attachment. And what secure attachment means is that you have the ability to regulate your own emotions in the presence of someone else, that you don't get too attached to an outcome, you're not too reactionary, you're able to see both sides of the situation. It doesn't mean that you don't have your feelings, but it means that you're able to respond in a contingent way, in a way that takes care of yourself and the other person. But when we grow up in a situation where, let's say, for example, the caregivers were codependent or enmeshed, and they're using the child in some ways to compensate for their own faults, we're going to get a child that's more preoccupied, a child that's more clingy, a child that does not ever get to individuate or differentiate from its parents. And so the child's capacity for growing independently gets stunted. Their capacity for self-knowledge gets hobbled. And so they're always looking for another to make them feel okay. And in the parlance of addiction, we see this a lot in children that are love addicted, or adults rather, that are love addicted, because as children, they always had to take care of the other's needs. So as adults, they become preoccupied with relationships. And making sure that they're okay in relation to someone else. And that's a lopsided relationship. It's not particularly healthy. If parents are neglectful, then we're going to get a more dismissive or avoidant type of attachment, since the need for connection was particularly painful for the child. The child might have been looking for connection or attachment, but the parent was avoidant. And that means that the parent was simply insensitive, didn't really pay attention. It doesn't mean that they were yelling or screaming or abusive in some ways. They were neglectful or at best insensitive. So that child is going to give up trying to win love, and is going to avoid conflict and avoid intimacy, and avoid being in close proximity, because they can't really tolerate, and they don't have a compass for how to do that. Paul says, can a child receive one sort of dysfunctional attachment from one parent and a different from the other? Yes. And likewise, if that same child is getting some love and attention from a school teacher, if they have one secure attachment, that can make all the difference in the world for that child. And Roger asks, can parents exhibit both enmeshment and avoidance? Well, typically one parent is more enmeshing and one parent is more avoidant. But a parent can flip-flop between those polarities, certainly. And so Paul, when you say, I was afraid you would say that, what do you mean by that? But yes, you can have one parent that's very enmeshing, and both of you are males that are writing in. If you have a mother that uses you as a surrogate spouse, that gets all her needs met from you emotionally, she confides in you, you're her confidant because your father was absent or abusive, then that gives the child a terrible message. It leaves him thinking that he's more omnipotent, he gets way more responsibility than he should be getting in taking care of her. And he's also going to feel inadequate as a male, because he can never really give her what she needs because she's his mother. And there can often be some covert sexual messaging in that as well, which can leave the boy in adulthood afraid to get in relationships with other women because he feels like he's being disloyal to his mother. And that's what Ken Adams calls a disloyalty bind. So it's very difficult to start to break those chains, and yet it's essential for healthy functioning. Likewise, if a parent is avoidant or abandoning in some ways, that's going to leave the child hungry and longing for a relationship with that gender, typically. So Paul's saying, I had a neglectful sort of abandonment from my overwhelmed mother and a violent sexual abuse enmeshment from my father. So yes, that's extraordinarily traumatic. If your mother is neglectful and she's abandoning you, that means she can't come to your rescue. And then your father is abusing you. And oftentimes male sexual abusers can be very perversely enmeshing also. They abuse the child, they then make the child feel special, and they take care of the child after they abuse them, which makes for extremely distorting messages. And that, of course, requires some very deep and careful psychotherapeutic work over time. So with the fearful or and avoidant attachment that comes from early conditioning or later trauma through the kind of abuse, really, Paul, that you're talking about, that can greatly distort our judgments of other people as well as our own. Our own feelings and our actions are something we're unsure of. So the example we grew up with literally becomes our way of navigating our relationships because they're so deeply rooted. And so it seems like we'd have more luck shedding our skin than setting a new example from what I'm talking about, because these mechanisms are encoded in both our central nervous system and our autonomic nervous systems, meaning in our brains and in our bodies. So these are now tendencies that have gotten both wired together, they've gotten kind of chunked together in our memory system. And so it's no fault of our own that we do what we do. And yet, depending on our level of intelligence and capacity for insight, we start to have the experience of watching ourselves do things that are distorted and knowing that we're hurting ourselves and knowing that we're setting a bad example because of the way that we're behaving. And yet we can't help ourselves because we need somebody else, someone who has been more secure, who can help us start to sort these things out. So what we are fortunate to see is that there are shining examples all around us of people who have transformed their lives, who have been able to align their words and their deeds with their values, and even though they came from distorted families as well. And so we want to look at those people and say, oh, that's curious. How did they do that? And how can I do that? And what's missing for me, whereby I know that my integrity and my values are not aligning with my actions. And what do I need to do? And how can I help myself with that? So I'm curious if anybody has any questions about any of what I just talked about. So this notion of, the example that we get from childhood and how that impacts who we are today and how we behave today. A colleague of mine named Darsha Narvez has just written an article in Psychology Today, which she's talking about how crucial the touch of an infant is. And you think about how exquisitely sensitive and soft an infant's skin is, and how tender and nubile and barely born we are as infants. I mean, there are people who talk about infancy and the first year of life as an out-of-body pregnancy because the infant needs to be so close to the mother's body or the primary caregiver's body all the time. And she's talking about how even touch communicates the parent's mood, the parent's neurochemicals, essentially, that are coursing through their own body. So in other words, if the mother is extremely stressed out and she's touching or holding the baby, that extreme stress is being communicated and delivered right into the autonomic nervous system of the infant. And we don't think about these things, and we're certainly not taught these things in our culture, about how to talk to children, touch children, breathe with children, think about them in this infantile state, and how crucial it is to the developing brain and body. Instead, people treat children the way that they might treat, a newborn puppy who can fend for itself a little bit better than a baby can. And there's a level of neglect that occurs in all of these levels of attachment. And then as we age into who we are, we bump up against these difficulties that we have. And then we start to see that we feel like we want to be good people, and we are good people, but our actions aren't lining up with being a good person. So for today's, example, I want to ask you, what kind of example are you setting each moment? What sort of examples have you set today already? How did you leave your house today? How did you talk to your partner this morning? How did you drive to work? Were you in a rush? Were you close to mowing people down? Or did you breathe and take your time getting to where you were going? In what ways do you set an example, even if it's the way that you behave in your workplace? After you pour a cup of coffee, do you clean up after yourself or do you just leave a mess for the next person? And these are exquisite mindfulness practices also, where we start to watch our every move. We start to watch that this notion of doing unto others, that whatever you do is what's going to be mirrored back to you. So the example you set gets sent back to you. If your actions were to instantly boomerang back to you, would you still act the same? So if when you threw something in the trash can and it misses the trash can and you don't pick it up to bend down to pick it up, if immediately somebody threw that piece of trash back at you, would you still not bend down to pick it up? Because imagine if everybody did that, what the world would look like if we just had trash everywhere because nobody was being responsible. So even simple acts of kindness set examples, like when you go to the grocery store and you put the groceries in your car, do you deliver the grocery cart back to where it came from? Or do you just sort of leave it there for the next person or hope it doesn't hit the next person's car? And again, this is symptomatic of the very, very stressful world that we live in, where it's always feeling like we don't have enough time. And yet that one simple act helps to create order. And maybe someone else sees you doing that today, and it reminds them that they too should do it. But more importantly, how does this play out in your love relationships? In what way are you setting examples for your children, for your partner in your own household? And I'm curious if anybody has any thoughts about that, because that saying that you reap what you sow comes to mind here, that whatever we put forward is what we get back. And doing to others an act you'd rather not have done to you reveals a personal conflict internally. And asking yourself, was that the best way to handle this situation? Could I have been nicer in the way I talk to my partner? Could my gesture have been more loving, more kind? Or was I just brusque and short and kind of blowing my anxiety through that person? So in what ways are you exemplifying what you want to come back? Sometimes people talk about wanting more intimacy in their relationships, or more romance, or more love, or more play, or more kindness, and yet they're not setting the example of that gives their partner the cue that they can behave in kind. So ask yourself where you're not participating in your relationship, where you are waiting for your partner to initiate, your partner to come towards your partner to give you what you want and what you need or what's lacking for you. So see if you can maybe make a list of that today as you go through your day and notice the ways in which you're setting an example. Another sort of question or test about this is, what kind of example do you set when you're alone? Imagine if the world were watching your behaviors all the time, even in your most private moments. Would you want everyone to see you slipping into your little comas of rage or panic or lust or self-loathing? What happens in those secret moments in our own lives? What happens to you in those moments? Is that really the best in you that's operating in that moment? Or are you letting yourself regress in some ways to some base level because you're feeling sorry for yourself, or you're feeling like a victim, or you're feeling like poor me, or today's the day for the pity party? What's really going on in those moments? What kind of example are you setting to yourself? Now, that's kind of a complicated thing, because whenever we're tired or we are, what's the word I'm looking for, depleted in some ways, we naturally start to regress to our primary attachment style. And these attachment styles, by the way, are fluid for the most part. They're also specifically set forth by different researchers in different ways. So you want to be careful about how you use them. But it's good to know whether you are generally avoidant, generally anxious avoidant, or anxious dismissive, or if you're generally preoccupied or generally anxious and fearful. So which one of those configurations are you? And notice that when you're under duress or stress, how you regress to that primary way of being. And that there's some part of you, some child part of you, that either wants to be left alone, if you're avoidant and you're anxious. If you're dismissive, you really want to push everybody away and isolate. If you're preoccupied, you want to, grab onto someone to make you feel better. If you're afraid all the time and avoidant, you're likely going to be flip-flopping back and forth. So, who are you, and what happens to you in those moments? And just because you're covering it up all the time doesn't mean it's not happening. So if you're always covering up your anxiety or your avoidance or pushing people away or clinging to people, you want to examine that closely with someone else, because we cannot heal our attachment wounds by ourselves. We really need a trusted other, whether it's a 12-step community or an individual therapist or some sort of faith-based group that you gather with, but it has to be with another human being or in a group setting, because that's where you're going to get the feedback about how you're behaving and what the impact you're having on other people, which also includes the good example you set. When people say to you, you're doing a good job, or we're really grateful for what you've done, or thank you, that is a proper mirroring coming back to you. Just as someone saying to you, you always have you noticed that you interrupt people when they're talking all the time? That's not maybe a positive mirroring, but it is a constructive criticism coming back. And when you can hear it as such, and you can really tolerate the shame that comes up around hearing that, and start to notice, oh, I really do that. And why do I do that? Well, maybe I do it because I'm anxious, or I don't feel heard, or I want to make sure I get my point across, or I was never understood in my family, so I really, really, really have to be understood. And then you start to have critical thinking and insight about why you do what you do, because you've got trusted people around you mirroring back the good, the bad, and the ugly, and you're able to hear it. That's what starts to change these attachment styles. So it's important that you have people around you that are going to be honest with you. So any other questions or thoughts at this juncture? Paul says, I flip-flop between the dismissive avoidant and the fearful avoidant, and I'm grateful for the presence of my therapeutic program helpers urging me into a more accurate view of what you do. That's great. And you may always do that. So what's crucial for you is to just notice that you're doing it, to really practice self-compassion with yourself, and to say, oh, there's that thing that I'm doing again. I'm pushing somebody away right now because they're too close. Or I'm getting scared because somebody's too close, and now I'm pushing them away in a different way. So I either dismiss them, or I start to get afraid. And those are flip sides of the opposite of the same coin, for sure. So Paul, for you, I really would recommend that, and I've talked about this before, there's a book called Mindfulness Self-Compassion. It's a workbook that you can get online by Kristen Neff. And I think it would be so useful for you to work with that workbook so that you can start to really, really live with forgiveness and mindfulness, and just notice it's a tendency. It's a tendency in the same way that slumping might be. Like if you don't sit up straight, somebody says to always remind you to sit up straight, sit up straight, sit up straight. Or if you, like growing up, we always had our parents telling us not to put our elbows on the table. And so we learn to not put our elbows on the table when we eat. These are habituated experiences that we can change because our brains are very, very automatic. And when we learn things, we have these both neuronal networks that fire together and wire together. We have memory that consolidates, and we have body memories and movements that also consolidate or chunk together in a way. And a good example of this is thinking about your car and getting into your car. When you get into your car, there are a whole host of bodily based movements, motoric gestures that are deeply encoded in the brain so that you don't have to think about it. You get into the car, you put your coffee in the holder, you shut the door, you lock the door, put on your seatbelt, lift the brake, turn on the ignition, put the car in reverse and go. And all of that happens like that. And it's consolidated in that way because we are so automatic and so habituated. And the reason the brain works that way is that it gives us more space in our brains to learn new things. And so this flip-flopping that Paul is talking about between dismissive avoidant and fearful avoidant are adaptive and habituated strategies for survival that you actually no longer need, because you're not living with your mother who was neglectful or your father who was horrendously abusive. You are now an adult, and you can start to rewire those portions of your brain by just being mindful and being kind to yourself. Somebody asked, what examples or key qualities come to mind for you when thinking of those who have transformed their lives to align their words and deeds with their values? Well, I would say, for one thing, alignment would be a good word that comes to mind, that those people are aligned with what they say and what they do, and they have become authentic. They are who they say they are. There's no hidden agenda. If you were to live with that person, and they wouldn't automatically, change 3 months in from who they were when you were dating them. They would pretty much be the same person no matter what context that you put them in. So there's a consistency, there's alignment, there's authenticity. Those would be the key qualities for someone who's living in a way that's congruent, so that their words and their actions and their values line up. And that is really, when that's happening, we are then integrated human beings. And sure, we're going to make a mistake. We might get, aggravated at somebody in traffic, or we're in a hurry and we don't put the shopping cart back. I mean, we're all human beings, but it's not because it's unintentional or unconscious. There are decisions that get made along the way, and we recognize there are consequences for our actions. And so Paul says, I've been an orphan since 2000. Well, that's probably been to your advantage, is what I would say. And I think that's worth noting for many people, that when you come from such a horrendously abusive background, that the people who hurt you are not in any kind of therapy themselves, they've not healed themselves, and they remain toxic and dangerous, then it's best to stay away from them and create your family of choice rather than your family of origin. And many of us do that at this time in Thanksgiving. Many of us go to, quote, orphan Thanksgivings, where we gather with friends. We gather with people that we've chosen to be around, who mirror back to us our strength, our beauty, our kindness, our abundance, all of the qualities that we all share, and that are grateful for us in their lives. Not people that are going to pull us down or denigrate us, or make us feel bad about ourselves. I mean, life is difficult enough, so we don't want to surround ourselves with people that are going to hurt us. So examine your circle of friends. Look at who is reflecting back to you, and do you like that reflection? And that sort of aligns with that saying, when people are dating or they're in relationship, where someone says that, he or she brings out the best in me. That's one of the reasons people love other people, is because our partner should bring out the best in us, not the worst in us. And so ask that about your circle of friends. Does this person bring out the best in me? Or are they always, am I always argumentative with them? Or am I always annoyed by them? Are they bringing out the part of me that's paranoid or angry or ungrateful? And if that's the case, you really want to re-examine that relationship. So when life is throwing us difficulties, when life is confounding us, we're not really sure what's going on, we have to ask ourselves for healthy examples. Who can help me in this time of need? And I think that is one of the things that we have the luxury of having as human beings, is choice. That we have these big brains, these prefrontal cortices, and we can make choices about who we choose to be around and the consequences of our behaviors. And Gabrielle says, I'm the same person, but I have changed some of my behaviors, lying, promiscuity, etc. How can I know that I've really have changed? And I would say that the reflection of the people around you will let you know if you've really changed. And of course, that's funny that you say that. And sorry about all the sirens in the backgrounds today. um, that we are who we are. We are who we are. We are made up of our genetics. We're made up of the region we grow up in, the family of origin we grow up in, the habits that we have set up, the adaptive strategies we've learned to survive. We are who we are fundamentally, but that doesn't mean that we cannot change who we are in our hearts and what our actions are. Because there's certain idiosyncrasies that we're probably never going to change. The kind of foods we like, for example, or our sleeping patterns to a certain extent. But if you have really stopped lying, if you've stopped being promiscuous, that means, especially stopping lying, then that means that you are more congruent with who you say you are. So of course you've changed. If you're less promiscuous, that means that you are hurting yourself less and less. You're not trashing yourself and throwing yourself away in ways that are harmful to you. And so that is an act of self-love. So I would recommend to you and to anyone else who is asking this question to send an email out to 10 friends and ask them what they think your unique qualities are. Ask them how they've seen you change in the last year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, and see what you get back from those people. And you have to be willing to hear what they have to say. Again, the good, the bad, and the ugly, assuming they're going to be doing it with some kindness and they're not doing it in a vicious way. So make sure you choose people that are trusted. But I always think that's a very helpful exercise to people to get a sense of what would the people around me that I trust and care about say about how I've changed? And someone says, if I can't trust the people around me to provide the truth about me because they project and are not honest, then I would say you need new people around you. That you need to find people who you can trust, and to make new friends. And our friends are typically a reflection of where we're at. If we have good people around us, people that care about us, then that means we are good and we are caring. So you have to look at how you're behaving in your relationships, and that is absolutely what will be reflected back to you. One way to find out about that is to throw a birthday party for yourself and see who shows up, and see how they treat you. And if nobody shows up, that tells you something. You've got the wrong crew of people around you. But when they do show up, what do they write in their cards? What do they say to you? What small gifts or trinkets or desserts do they bring you? How are people mirroring back to you what you're giving? Meg writes, for many, many years, I carried a ton of shame around my sexuality and sexual behavior. I was molested as a young child for several years and carried a sense of blame for it, which is extremely common for children who are molested as children. They always think it's their fault, that they did something wrong. It took years of therapy to shift my understanding about this. The self-esteem was the hardest to evolve. At a 12-step meeting I heard, I raised my self-esteem by doing esteemable things. That statement resonated with me hugely. So my example would be knowing through internal wisdom when I felt that my behavior was correct. So that's beautiful, and thank you for sharing that. So she's saying that knowing through her internal wisdom when she knew her behavior was correct. That's how she knew that things were going well. And for years, I didn't make my bed and I felt terrible about it, but just wouldn't change that. That was a behavior change I made that made me feel good about who I was and how I was living. I've made other changes like this and I still have changes yet to be. So that's really sweet, and thank you for that, because I agree, the act of making one's bed can change the way you feel about yourself, because it's an act of mothering or fathering. It's an act of self-care. It's an act of, I'm going to make sure that when I am so tired at the end of the day and I want to fall into bed, that my sheets are clean, that my bed is tidy, so that I'm getting into a bed that was made for me by my own self. Likewise, do you have food in your refrigerator? Is your space clean? Do you take care of yourself? And that's what I meant earlier about what kind of example do you set when you're alone? What example are you setting for yourself? And how are you treating your very own self, first and foremost? And then are you engaging in what they say in the program, or call in the program, esteemable acts? Things that make you feel good about yourself. Whether it's, putting in a quarter in a meter that's run out for some stranger whose car you don't know, or helping somebody with their groceries or across the street, or giving service in some way to somebody that really you're not getting anything tangible back from, but you know that you did a good deed for today. That is a way to know whether you've really changed, and that will be reflected back to you tenfold. It will always come back to you. So I appreciate those, examples from others as well about how we know we've changed and what we can do to elevate our self-esteem and to elevate these qualities that somebody asked about to when we think about transformation. And self-esteem comes both from esteemable acts, but also from self-compassion. How I treat myself, what I do for others, how I treat myself. I think that's how we could look at it. So esteem may come from what I do for others, but it's got to be not from a narcissistic place of look at me and look at all I'm doing. It's not that. It's like an anonymous donor that you give quietly. You give because you're not looking to get anything back. You're doing it because you're in alignment with yourself. It makes your heart and your soul feel good. And it makes your day just a little bit brighter or a little bit sunnier. And sometimes, we can make attempts to do things for other people and end up kind of, people might feel like you're actually in the way, or you're a little bit weird or odd for doing it. So you want to make sure that you're not overstepping boundaries. And I'll give you a funny example. Last week I came to work and I parked behind a car, and I noticed what kind of car it was. And 3 hours later, I went out just for a lunch break or something to just go, to leave my office. And that same car was parked in front of me. And not only was it parked in front of me, but the engine was running. And I thought, oh, that's so weird that the engine's running. And I decided that I was going to be a good citizen all of a sudden. And I walked up to the driver's side of the car to look inside to see if the ignition was on, was the door locked, like should I go back in the building and alert someone? And I didn't see anybody. And all of a sudden a woman popped up because she had her chair reclined. She was sitting in the car on her phone, and she looked at me with this sort of act of terror, terror on her face, as if I was, some sort of interloper, or maybe going to break into her car or do something weird. And I was so taken aback, and so was she, and I apologized. And then I explained to her that the engine was running and I was concerned, and so it was all good. But if that were a situation where, let's say, you're a male and you're trying to help a female with her groceries, that could be construed as a little bit dangerous for that female. So you want to be careful about your acts of kindness and your esteemable acts. They should be consensual for sure, and you should make sure that the context is appropriate for them. So just a word about being careful about that. So take care of yourself and take care of others is largely the message. So we never have to learn hard lessons on our own. We always learn them with other people. Find a safe space with friends or a supportive community where you can learn to lead yourself by example, where you can be the example in groups where you can get direct feedback from other people. And that way, you're not operating in a vacuum. So a reminder to you that if you have any questions about sex, love, relationships, our intake counselors are available to you at 310-843-9902. We're always happy to answer any questions, provide you with additional resources anywhere around the country, whether it's books or therapy, or some other possibility. So I hope this conversation about example has been useful to you, and I hope you go forward today and think about the example that you're setting. Think about the ways that you can engage in acts that are esteemable. Think about the ways that you can exercise self-compassion with yourself, so that you can be a bright and shining example to all those around you. So happy November. If you want to receive a copy of Mirror of Intimacy, I want to remind you to go to Amazon.com. If you're so inclined, please leave us a review, whether it's anything like simple as great book, or anything like that. We love hearing from you and really, really appreciate it. And I'm grateful to all of you for spending time with me today and for sharing this webinar also with anyone who you think might enjoy hearing it. So take good care, be a good example, and happy Thanksgiving to all. And I look forward to talking to you in December. Bye for now.